the battle that gives no quarter between two partial truths whose ambition is to present themselves as global truths, which is precisely that of the monotheistic model that has been politicized. On the one hand, the unvarnished truth of Islamic fundamentalism, whose truth completely coincides with itself, a truth written in the Quran and from there primed for world conquest. On the other hand, the empty truth of Western nihilism, of secularized Christianity, according to which the truth is that truth does not exist, since what matters is only the principle of technological performance, the logic of making money and of total production. These are the two truths, the one completely full, the other completely empty, the one present to itself and the other having withdrawn into the absence of its own truth, but both absolute, exclusive and excluding, that are in conflict with one another, having the very same immunitarian obsession, so as to conquer the globality of what reflected back on itself, bursting with itself until the explosion. Political monotheism, the idea that there must correspond to one single God, one single king, and one single realm, expresses the very essence of immunization in its most violent version. The closing down of borders that cannot tolerate anything outside, that exclude the very idea of an outside, that do not admit any sort of extraneousness that might threaten the logic of the one everything. Without wanting to examine the political, social, and cultural responsibility for such a state of affairs, I would like to limit myself to this undeniable fact, entrusted to auto-immunitary regime that is directed obsessively to identifying what is properly its own, the world, which is to say human life in its totality, doesn't have a great chance for survival. The negative protection of life, strengthened so much that protection is reversed into its own opposite, will wind up destroying not only the enemy outside it, but also its own body. The violence of the interiorization, the abrogation of the outside, of the negative, could be reversed into an absolute exteriorization, into a complete negativity. And so, what can we do to break out of this logical death? What can we do to break out of this logical death? What can we find as the ontology of the actuality will have it? The point at which the present can be inverted towards another possible present. It's difficult to offer a full response to similar questions. What is clear is what we can no longer do. We certainly can't return to the Westphalian model with states acting in concert, states which are completely sovereign with respect to themselves and free with regard to all other states, in a model that dominated the world for at least 500 centuries. In the same way, an equilibrium cannot be reconstructed between blocks facing off against each other as that which dominated the world from the end of the Second World War to the last decades of this last century. Yet, a return to constellation of ethnically defined sites is equally unimaginable. Sites joined together by an absolute relation between territory, blood, and language. The path to take in my opinion, doesn't pass through the dialectic between global and local, which many contemporary political philosophies refers to, but rather refers to the construction of a new relation between singular and universal. Yet, this in part can be taught only by breaking with the monotheistic paradigm and its constitutively immunitary logic. The question which I here want to pose radically is that of escaping the theological political lexicon, in which despite everything we are still find ourselves in, as is demonstrated by the monotheistic syndrome that I spoke of earlier. And I am not speaking now of the Islamic world, but rather of the West, permitted with political theology in its very secularization, as also Carl Schmitt has already explained to us. Of course, to do so, that is to be free from the theological political lexicon out of which all our categories originate, beginning with that of sovereignty and running to that of juridical person, isn't at all easy. But there is no other way. We can't turn back to the clock to a world that is constituted by pieces that are autonomous in themselves and potentially hostile to what is outside. That would mean standing pat with the destructive and self-destructive logic of Communitas, when we are instead concerned with returning to thinking the reverse of Communitas in the open and the plural form of Communitas. The world, which is by now irreversibly united, is not only to be thought but practiced as a unity of difference, as a system of distinction, in which distinction and difference aren't points of resistance or a residue with respect to the process of globalization, but rather its same form. Naturally, I know well enough that transforming this philosophical formula into real practice, into political logic and conceptual language is anything but easy. And yet, we need to find the mode, the forms, the conceptual language for converting the unitary declensions that all political fundamentalists have adopted in a singular and plural logic in which the differences become precisely that which keep the world united. I believe that the West has in itself the strength, the resources, the cultural means to attempt such an operation of radical conversion, and is notwithstanding the recurring temptation to make the world homologous to only one model, from Heraclitus on, notion that one could be united not by homogeneity, but by difference and diversity, is part of the tradition that the West produces, but never carried out fully. A good part of the West's violent history is marked by the repression and forgetting of such a tradition. The tragic paradox that we are living today lies in the fact that those who have declared war on the West have reproduced and strengthened to the point of paroxysm the very same phobic obsession, the same conviction that community or relation between those who differ cannot exist, which isn't that of mortal autoimmune conflict. In a situation such as this, in which the most destructive tendencies are reflected and doubted in the same road to war, the only possibility is that of breaking the mirror in which the self is reflected without seeing anything but itself.